Hi there, folks. Welcome to the LVN webinar for Innovation Inspiration for Legal, what we can learn from other industries. I'm Marshall Bradshaw. I'm part of the LVN staff, and I wanted to let you know just some housekeeping notes before I hand it over to Amani to moderate. So the number one thing is that we have a Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. That's different from the chat box. You're invited at any point during the webinar to click the Q&A box and ask your questions. That way, the presenters will be able to see them separate from the chat and be able to save them towards the end or answer them during their presentations. That being said, you're still welcome to pop into the chat box and say hello. Also, as you heard, as you logged in, this event is being recorded, though don't worry, audience webcams are not active. So if you are on vacation in some just beautiful autumnal wonderland, or if you're sitting on your couch in your PJs, we won't see it either way. And finally, this webinar, of course, is free for members. If you are someone who paid to attend, thank you for coming. If you like this, you're welcome to become a member yourself. Come over to www.legalvalue.com and see about signing up. We'd be happy to have you join again. I think that's it for me. So I will hand it over to Amani.
Great. Thanks, Marshall. So welcome again to our session on innovation inspiration for legal, what we can learn from other industries. Thrilled you've joined us, as I think we have some really great presentations lined up for you today. My name is Amani Smathers. I'm a senior practice innovations analyst at Chapman and Cutler, previously at Davis Wright Tremaine and Cypher Shaw, and also an adjunct instructor at Michigan State University College of Law on business of law topics. And I'll be your host for what is our fifth and final session of the innovation track of the Legal Value Network webinars for 2021. So far this year, our innovation subgroup of the LVN Education Committee has brought you 4 sessions on topics on innovation within the legal services market. We've talked about the hype curve and how to deliver value with data, sustainable innovation in legal, and a great session in August on change management methodology and case studies. So if you missed any of those, you can find them on the LVN website under Thought Leadership and then past webinars. And I really want to thank the other members of our Innovation Webinar Committee, particularly Bethany Knobloch and Matt Walquist, for helping organize today's session, because I'm really excited for today's topic. It's probably the one I've been most looking forward to all year, not to lessen any of the others. But as a community of legal professionals interested in innovation, we love hearing what our peers are doing to modernize and bring new technology and service models to their law firms, to their organizations, to their clients. But there's so much knowledge and inspiration to be gained by looking beyond the legal services market to areas that are seeing tremendous change and disruption, transformation, whether that be from regulatory changes or new technology or new competitors or all three. So I'm really excited to learn from some of the colleagues that we have here today who are innovating in the medical, energy, data storage and crypto, and automotive sectors, and hear from them about how their companies are approaching these market challenges in their markets and how they're approaching opportunities with innovation. So we'll have some very concentrated information and insights today. The format is 4 short prepared presentations rather than a panel. And so that this session can be interactive and collaborative, I do encourage you, to ask questions of the speakers in the chat or the Q&A features on Zoom while we're all here together, and also to reflect afterwards as well. There will be so much content in this session and a lot of lessons to take away. So I encourage you to kind of reflect and share what lessons you did take away, either during the session or afterwards, on LinkedIn or on Twitter. I'll be using the hashtag LVN Innovation. So if you want to share, I encourage you to use that as well, and we can continue the conversation. I'll also say that I expect a couple of our speakers will draw some suggested lessons for legal, including both how we as leaders can approach innovation in our markets and businesses, and also what to keep in mind for how we can better serve our clients who may be going undergoing transformative changes in their businesses. And then a couple of our speakers may not suggest, lessons for legal necessarily, but impart their expertise in their area and leave it to us as the audience to consider and reflect on their presentations and draw our own lessons for, from their experiences innovating in their own markets. So with that, I'd like to ask our speakers to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into the presentation. So I'm going to start. We'll go Dave, Rafael, Rachel, and Ryan. So Dave, if you'd like to give a brief introduction.
Certainly. Thanks, Amani. My name is Dave Fabry. I'm an audiologist by training, and my role with Starkey, one of the incumbent hearing aid manufacturers in the global hearing aid market, is as Chief Innovation Officer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rafael Figuerett. I work for an energy and natural gas company in Houston, originally brought in to head up the legal department and recently moved into strategy and business development.
Hi, everyone. I am Rachel Horn, Head of Marketing and Communications at the Filecoin Foundation. We are a decentralized open source storage network powered by cryptocurrency.
Hi, good morning. Ryan Bowers. I am Senior Counsel at General Motors, and I focus my work on our autonomous and connected car technologies.
Thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentations. And we're going to kick off with Dave and hear about the medical device industry, particularly at Starkey, and what they are experiencing in terms of innovation and regulatory changes.
Excellent. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay, good. So indeed, I've been nearly 40 years an audiologist and worked and divided my time between industry roles like I have now and also in academic clinical practices. And I'll pull in some of those examples as well during my presentation. Ever since it was first published in 1997, I've been a fan of Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma, who was really, Christensen was the first to define the term disruptive innovation. And it's been widely used, and I would even say overused to the point that it becomes both ubiquitous and meaningless. And I'd like to define a couple ways of what initially attracted me to his terminology of an environment that was prone to disruption. Typically, first of all, it had to have multiple layers in terms of quality of use, in terms of the cost of the devices and user expectation. In our space, these demanding users could be everything from Mayo Clinic, Ivory Tower, medical institutions. Included in that, you can buy hearing aids from Costco and from Walmart. And increasingly on that, the other element that Christensen referred to was that when there is this range of performance that patients or customers can utilize that is easily definable in terms of either the performance or the cost, and their experience is differentiated by that along the ordinate here, then they're not going to be prone to disruption. But the moment that that range compresses so that patients and customers can no longer experience a difference in the outcome on the basis of where they originate from, low quality or higher demanding users, that's when it's prone to disruption. And then finally, relatively low adoption rates, despite the fact that there is a strong market need, is another ingredient that Christensen referred to as being necessary for disruption to occur. The reason that this occurs then is usually from an outside entity when you have incumbent players that make up the majority of distribution streams, as you see in here. And when they become complacent, with regards to the status quo, is when disruption can occur. So when we look at my space, the hearing aid market and hearing loss, the reasons that it resonated with me is that hearing loss is a global health issue. There is a strong market and societal need, given that currently there are about 500 million people around the world with hearing loss, estimated to be about 36 million in the United States. But in the next 30 years, that number is expected to approach 1 billion people with hearing loss due to the aging population around the world. And the second element then that is in Christensen's model was relatively low adoption rate. In the United States, only about a third of those with hearing loss actually wear hearing aids or some sort of hearing device today. So in terms of societal need and adoption rates being relatively low, that has led to regulatory efforts to try to improve accessibility and affordability for hearing aids, leading up to the creation of an over-the-counter hearing aid regulation that was passed in 2017 and will likely go into effect by mid-2022. Also, from the other end on this is on the current Medicare expansion bill, hearing aid coverage is included. Now, this is still dynamic, but hearing aids, providing Medicare coverage for hearing aids is in the proposed House reconciliation package that is currently under consideration with a timeline shortly after that OTC implementation. So we're really seeing both the creation of over-the-counter and Medicare reimbursement as being disruptors to the professionals, audiologists, and to the industry. And really what it looks at is this creation of a continuum, as you see on the left-hand side, as we've been for some time in disease detection, diagnosis, and progression, all the way to the other side with the consumer electronics, Internet of Things, over-the-counter, direct-to-consumer products, and really finding that sweet spot for personalized care as to whether this is a disease-related model, a medical model, or is it hearing devices as commodity items. So going back to then that Clayton Christensen model, I want to talk about 3 areas where Starkey has looked at trying to self-disrupt, which is the exception rather than the rule. It's usually an outside entity that comes in and serves as that disruptor. We've been on a mission to self-disrupt, and I'll give 3 examples. First, my first recommendation is that it is essential, from the words of Nietzsche, to discover your why, your corporate why, your entity. And as he said, he or she who has a why to live can bear almost any how, any outside disruption. When we look and reflect on our 50 years in this industry, our focus has really not been to focus on building the components that go into the hearing aid, but to look at the way that hearing products connect people through better hearing. And when we look at consumer satisfaction with hearing aids, those individuals who bought hearing aids within the last 5 years would recommend both the devices and the hearing care professionals, the audiologists or dispensers, for an evaluation. And that really has been our sweet spot, is that we believe our technology in the hands of the professional are what deliver patient or customer delight. And it has been that we've primarily been a B2B supplier, where we make the products, the audiologist or the dispenser puts them on patients' ears. One of the issues is the cost of these devices is quite high and has been in the past out of pocket. The average cost for hearing aids in the US is around $2,200 per ear. Most are fitted on 2 ears. The challenge is that perception of the cost of the device doesn't reflect the service component that is often bundled. The model is bundling service and technology, leading to the perception of the cost. When we look at our fundamental mission and beyond our why of focusing on hearing, in that we're not a consumer electronics company like Apple or Samsung, but we're focused in that patient relationship with the provider. I had the distinct pleasure of working at Mayo Clinic for about 15 years of my career, where their central value is the needs of the patient come first, not the doctors, not the professionals, come hell or high water. I think this picture was taken in July in Rochester, Minnesota, but they always focus on the needs of the patient. And in this issue, by focusing on those needs that patients have, not only related to their hearing, but also the comorbidities with hearing loss. When we look at the prevalence of chronic conditions in those in the United States, age 65 and above, we see many of the familiar ones that you see here: hypertension, falls, arthritis. One factor that may not be as known to many of you is that there is a strong comorbidity between hearing loss and falls in the aging population. many of whom have hearing loss. By the time you reach the age of 70, about 50% of people have a measurable hearing loss. In addition, cardiovascular disease. Cardiologists will say that in the aging individual, the ear is an overall barometer of cardiovascular health, given that with hearing loss often comes risk and identifying that comorbidity to heart disease, diabetes, heart failure, risk of stroke. The final thing that's been in the last 10 years or so is that there is a strong link between untreated hearing loss and cognitive decline. This is really what gets people like myself, aging baby boomers, focused on the issue of closing that delay of 5 to 7 years from the time someone suspects that they have a hearing loss to when they move into action. So our focus at Starkey, the third element on this, is that once we know our why, and we discover that we're not a consumer electronics company, but focused in that B2B partnership with the emerging over-the-counter category, is another favorite of mine is Jim Collins, and talks about that the only reliable source of stability is a strong inner core, but then a willingness to change and adapt everything else except that core. If we're focused on individuals with hearing loss, I mentioned that our biggest competitor is not others in this space, but non-compliance. 2/3 of the people who have hearing loss do nothing. So how is it that we increase their interest in pursuing amplification? 3 years ago, we introduced the first product in our industry, a hearing aid that used embedded sensors in combination with artificial intelligence to link to those other health conditions by not only first and foremost amplifying sound appropriately, but tying in to that overall health and well-being. We delivered products that are connected directly to smartphones that enable tracking of physical activity like you would do on your wrist, but for that purpose of encouraging not only more physical activity that can relate to better cardiovascular health, and also standing to encourage musculoskeletal strength and prevent falls in individuals who are at elevated risk for falls. But then also on the other side, something you can't get off the wrist is looking at the way that hearing aids improve social engagement, using them throughout the day, interacting with other individuals, and wearing them in different environments. These factors, in combination with hearing aids that can detect a fall when the individual is wearing their devices and alert contacts via a cell phone text, and even show on a map the physical location where they were when they fell, are ways that we're moving hearing aids from have to wear devices into want to have devices that provide an expansion of the scope of practice for our current partners, those audiologists, but also resonating directly with the hearing aid user or potential hearing aid user to transform hearing aids from want to have or have to wear devices into those that they want to have. And so in summary, by focusing on our why during the pandemic and during this period of disruption that is upon us now, we stayed true to our core values of focusing on those individuals with hearing loss, while also redefining hearing loss and reimagining hearing aids through patient-focused and actually patient-driven technology to challenge assumptions and stigma associated with hearing loss. And by reinventing devices that from our single-purpose ones into multi-purpose, multifunction ones, we're focusing on hearing loss as an overall important health condition, which in turn prevents commoditization through innovations that benefit both patients and providers. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave. If you want to take down your slides, Rafael can get his going. But that was so relevant to me, both from the side of, I have 2 family members who use, both young and old, who use hearing aids. And they're looking forward to, as consumers, being able to get hearing aids over the counter. But then also on the professional side, you know, I work in law firms, and we are the incumbents in our industry. And so that insight of focusing on the why and using that to guide the self-disruption is really helpful and interesting to hear you. You know, there's there is a lot of background to suggest for innovators and entrepreneurs to focus on the why. And great to hear that kind of case study of how you're using it at Starkey. So thank you. And Rafael, if you want to kick off.
Yes, thanks, Amani, and thanks, Legal Value Network, for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Thanks to the audience as well for interest in signing up. So you can see my screen, I think, right? So this is a quick summary of my professional journey to where I am today. I'm a lawyer, and as I mentioned earlier this year, I formally transitioned into a strategy and business development role at my company. But before moving in-house in 2016, I worked at large law firms for 12 years. And for 8 of those 12 years, I focused my practice almost exclusively on the renewable energy sector, in particular in the financing and development of wind and solar power projects. And during all those years working in big law, I also always had an interest in and kind of gravitated towards the business functions of the firms. So the business of law always fascinated me, and I kind of saw myself as being part of 2 industries at the same time, like a double life, so to speak, the legal industry as a business itself and the energy industry. So these comparisons and observations between the 2 sectors, you know, the energy sector and the legal sector, and how they're both changing and evolving, sort of come naturally to me, I think. So this is proof that I do indeed think about and compare the 2 sectors all the time. I tweeted this in the middle of the Texas freeze-off last February, which I believe will go down as one of the worst power grid failures in the history of the country. We had no power or central heating at my house for 40 hours in the middle of a snowstorm in Houston, Texas, right? So, and the sad part was shortly after I tweeted that, a couple of pipes burst at my house, causing, you know, some water damage inside. So I guess, you know, legal industry gods were punishing me for being sort of a smart ass on Twitter. But all joking aside, the overarching message here is that major inflection points and weak signals are being observed in pretty much every industry right now, right? And although the energy sector has made significant progress over the last 10, 15 years, particularly with respect to shifting away from a centralized model of power generation, as I would discuss in a second, there's still many challenges to overcome, as we're experienced here in Texas this year. And before drilling down a bit more on some specific lessons which law could learn from the disruption I lived through in the energy sector, I wanted to talk a little bit about business model change, because this was the critical element in the exponential growth of distributed solar power specifically. And business model innovations typically travel well from industry to industry. And, you know, this cross-industry comparisons, like what we're doing here today, I believe are one of the best ways to see change in action. So applying a reframe that has already proved itself in another industry, I believe enhances prospects of hitting on something that makes, you know, business sense. And we see this in the marketplace all the time. So Airbnb inspires Uber, that in turn inspires others, right? And while technology is no doubt an important part of the equation as an enabler or as a booster, I kind of feel there's sometimes that's too much emphasis on the tech as the driver of changing legal. And I've been beating the drum for a while that I believe it's the people and the business models that need to change first to create the gaps for new technology to fill. In the energy sector, rooftop solar systems really didn't take off only because of tech innovation and equipment cost reductions. It really took off when some innovative players in the market started offering financing solutions to unlock the opportunity for homeowners and companies to actually do solar without a large upfront investment, capital investment, right? So what that created was a more diversified and reliable supply chain that allow, you know, residential, commercial, industrial power consumers an opportunity to generate their own power, and also to sell and re-inject excess solar generated energy back to the grid. So it's a classic business model tweak, right? It does not only relying on technological innovation. And the new market dynamic essentially breached the incumbent utility company economic moats and posed a significant disruptive threat to their business models and financial health. And the reason is because utilities' centralized network monopolies started to break down when customers became self-sufficient, in essence, self-sufficient competitors to the service that they were providing. And similarly, in the energy sector, changes in traditional law firm business models, accompanied by much needed regulatory reform, which we're starting to see more and more in several states in the U.S. and abroad as well. I think will create opportunities to sort of rethink and realign the delivery of legal services, reduce friction, and create new dimensions of value for both providers and for clients. And law firms now, much like the utility companies over the past decade, are divided on whether there's inevitable disruptions that are coming through, including, and very importantly, significant changes in clients' buying behaviors, buying habits, and buyer demands. So the consumers of legal services, right, are changing their buying behaviors. So these law firms will have a choice whether these represent threats or they represent opportunities, right? So like the incumbent utilities, the law firms also have huge natural advantages, large and diversified client bases, established brands, strong cash flows, and obviously substantive expertise. So to dive a little deeper, I've put out 3 potential lessons here, or sort of disruptive characteristics for the legal sector from the energy industry's transformation journey with solar. So I'll draw a few comparisons, continue drawing a few comparisons between incumbent utilities and law firms. I think that irrespective of industry, the shift from centralized models is forcing incumbents, and Dave touched on this as well. So for the first time in their existence, they need to figure out how to compete, number one, and also collaborate with other market players. And whether incumbent law firms innovate on their traditional business models or not, I think one thing is certain. They have started facing competition that they've never had to deal with before. And that ranges from the big 4 accounting firms, alternative legal service providers, distributed model law firms, the hybrid kind of law firm legal tech model, which Atrium tried to take a crack at, beefed up and tech-enabled legal departments, and other types of providers that frankly don't even exist yet because they'll innovate largely on entirely new operating and business models. And in fact, new competition actually coming from clients' internal legal departments. I think it's very analogous to what happened in the energy sector, as I mentioned earlier, with customers generating their own power from rooftop solar systems. So the shift in the competitive landscape is, in my view, a major inflection point happening in the legal industry right now. So as the legal services market decentralizes away from traditional law firms, we have entered a period of significant disaggregation, right? That's moving work to kind of the legal sector version of distributed power. And specifically with respect to the distributed model law firms, remote first type of law firms like, for example, Fisher Broyles and Scale LLP. What's happening is that clients increasingly have an opportunity to access specialized legal expertise without it being bundled together with expensive office overhead and associates whose value sometimes is difficult to discern. So in essence, the distributed model law firms could potentially inch the market away from the traditional sort of client law firm relationship to one that resembles more a network, an ecosystem, or a legal grid, right, as I like to say. Another major inflection point is the actual disaggregation of work, so unbundling. So at least at the enterprise level, which is sort of the world I live in-house legal departments have more options than ever now to rethink the entire job to be done and shift away from the legacy kind of artisanal model of one-on-one direct legal service. And so with that in mind, some incumbents adapt, of course, right? So in the power sector, while some utilities got stuck in their sort of obsolete models and mindsets. A subset of progressive companies have embraced the opportunity to use new technologies and business models to compete head-to-head with the new entrants. Just to give you a few examples. Some utility companies saw an opportunity and embraced distributed generation through massive investments in unregulated solar subsidiaries, distributed generation financing, and self-generation technology. Others have formed syndicates to improve the cost of, basically partnerships, right, to improve the cost and reliability of energy delivery, including some solar companies teaming up with storage and device makers like Nest to create integrated solutions. And for those utility companies that choose not to adapt, this could lead to a potential death spiral for them, right? Because as customers install distributed systems, utilities cost to maintain and operate the centralized grid are spread across a smaller demand base, therefore causing an increase in customer rates. And, you know, as a result, greater incentive for remaining customers to cut the cord. Likewise, in the legal sector, we're beginning to see differentiation between law firms that are kind of standing still versus those that are looking at turning, you know, the new potential sources of competition into products, services, and revenue. So it's now very commonplace to read announcements of, you know, large law firms launching legal operations consulting arms and legal tech incubator development programs, productization efforts, which I think is really interesting, and an on-demand lawyer offering, or some form of partnership with other market participants. And then, so on customer empowerment, just to sort of conclude, generally speaking, as customers in a digital age, we have been conditioned to expect seamless, efficient, customized interactions with our providers, right? In the energy space, in order to adapt to a decentralized and disaggregated business model, incumbent utilities had to drastically change their business models and business practices to meet customers' expectations. So one of the most fundamental decisions for them was whether they would become a consumer-centric business or just stick to simply managing the generation, transportation, distribution of power as a community supplier. So what power providers did was they began to reevaluate how they engage their customer segment. So utilities needed to provide customers with sort of easily digestible, personalized energy information that enabled customers to make smart decisions about their energy usage, including gamifying it and being able to compare their consumption against their neighbors, for example. Also about rate selection, et cetera. So it all became about deeply understanding users' data, operations, and consumption behaviors. And I think the same applies to law firms and legal providers. They should focus on demonstrating customer knowledge and understanding every corner, right? So identifying key touch points and moments where certain personalized insights will improve the overall customer experience. And just finally, I don't think the highly regulated sectors like energy or self-regulated sectors like the legal sector are immune to this at all. And we've seen this happen with the telecom industry as well, right? Customers simply stopped using the landline service. Same with solar. People didn't get off the centralized grid, right? They just stopped using the service. So the same could happen in the legal industry. Clients might just simply stop using certain providers and firms. Thank you again. I was happy to connect via email, Twitter, LinkedIn. Easy to find me.
Thanks so much, Rafael. And actually, your article on legalevolution.org really helped inspire this whole session. Rafael has an article called What Law Can Learn from the Disruption in the Energy Sector, which covers much of this content. So if you like reading, in addition to listening to webinars, I'll point you to that Legal Evolution article. Thank you. And if you want to take your slides down, we'll let Rachel get her slides up.
Okay. Hi there. Thanks so much for having me today. Thanks, Amani, and thanks, LVN, for putting this together. And I am so thrilled to be speaking after Dave and Rafael because the themes here are very strong. Distributed solar systems dovetails quite nicely with what I'm going to talk about today, which is distributed and decentralized data storage and the value of Web3. So I'm here today to talk about a project that I work on called the Filecoin Project, how it fits into this next generation of the internet that is sometimes called Web3 or the decentralized web. And before we dive in to what's ahead for the web as we know it, I do want to jump back in time just a few weeks to the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day when people around the globe started freaking out because Facebook had gone completely dark. On October 4th, Facebook experienced an outage, not the kind like where your lights blink or you have to reset the microwave, but for 5 hours, it was completely inaccessible to the 3.5 billion people around the world who depend on it for communication and for business. And it's not just Facebook. Everything that goes with it was paralyzed. Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger. Millions of people who use Facebook to sign into other apps, websites, appliances, smart TVs, thermostats, were locked out. And even Facebook employees were literally locked out. Their digital badges stopped working, leaving them unable to communicate internally or even get into their buildings. Facebook explained that the changes to its underlying infrastructure, to the systems that coordinate network traffic between data centers, had been disrupted. And it's kind of funny to imagine a Facebook employee trying in vain to unlock a conference room, but it's not so amusing when you think about people whose livelihoods depend on these systems and how they could possibly lose an entire day's worth of income. Facebook is just so deeply embedded in commerce and communication that that disruption really did lead to huge losses, and there's, in some cases, no chances of recovery. And we've seen this kind of loss throughout history. Take languages as a classic example. Nearly 10% of living languages have fewer than 10 speakers, and researchers estimate that about 90% of all languages will die out in the next 100 years. When you lose a language, you lose more than just words. You lose history and values and concepts, and you lose a unique way of seeing and understanding and interacting with the world. And sometimes you can even lose an entire distinctive culture. Once it's lost, it can't really be recreated or reconstructed. So what happens when we lose that kind of data and artifacts online? Well, in 2016, researchers evaluated that more than 3.5 million scientific and medical journals they evaluated 3.5 million, and they discovered that fully 75% of the links in these journals no longer led to the original references. So it was an inability to locate the source information for those journals. And that can have real-world consequences. So what about government records? Well, the state of Maine lost public records spanning from 1995 to 2001. And instead of being preserved in state archives, a decade and a half of state history, including almost every email sent, vanished. And some of these records could be vital to making or breaking legal cases. These are all stark reminders of how dependent we have become on a handful of giant corporations to preserve and protect our data. Information has increased logarithmically, as has access to it. In 2020, we humans created 2.5 quintillion data bytes every single day. That is 18 zeros. And that means that every person created, on average, 1.7 megabytes of data every single second. That makes it all the more important that we protect and preserve important digital records. And without good governance, that information is at risk of being manipulated or lost. Knowledge looks different today than it did 1,000 or even 100 years ago, but the need to preserve it hasn't changed. It's just gotten harder, and it's up to all of us to do that work together. The problem, and Rafael mentioned this in his presentation, with a lot of today's systems, including today's internet, is that it is centralized. And the vast majority of data making up the many websites Americans use every day sits on data warehouses owned by just 3 companies: AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. And as we just saw with Facebook, when one of these suffers a blackout, it takes down a lot with it, including websites that are massive contributors to the American economy. That's the problem with having single points of failure. But there is a better way. When we create a better version of the web, we can create a better version when we combine the storage capacity and computing power of all of our individual devices into a supercomputer-like network and store multiple copies of our data across these devices. On this decentralized version of the internet, websites stay up even if some nodes fail. the ability to access information doesn't depend on one single server or one company. And this is a much more robust, reliable platform for preserving humanity's most important information. So the project that I work on is called Filecoin, and it is a decentralized storage network that is powered by cryptocurrency. And it is built on a technology called IPFS, which stands for Interplanetary File System. So let's start there. On today's internet, when I visit a web page, that information is retrieved from a particular server somewhere in the world, and maybe it is very far away from me. And when I type a web address into a browser, I am essentially hoping that that information is still living in that particular place and that it hasn't moved. So imagine that you have just read a great book in physical copy and you recommend it to a friend by saying, it's at the New York Public Library, it's on the second floor, it's on the third shelf from the left, 5 books over. And for your friend to get that book, they would have to fly to New York. They would have to go to the public library. They would have to find that place on the shelf where the book is supposed to be. But what if it is not there? Like, what if somebody moved it? Or what if you find out that that's actually the book you've been carrying around in your bag all day? That's kind of essentially how today's internet works. It makes a lot more sense if you just tell your friend the name of the book and let your friend find it by name rather than by its location. And so that's essentially how IPFS works. Rather than retrieving content by where it is on the internet, it retrieves content by what it is on the internet. It uses something called content addressing. Content on the web is addressed directly using cryptographic hashes instead of by the reference to where the file is located on a specific server. And so that means you don't need a specific web address to find your file, you just need to know its hash. And if you already have it or somebody near you has it, you can retrieve it that way. The catch with IPFS is that for someone to store a file for you and make sure that it's accessible, their computer has to be live on the network. So that's where Filecoin comes in. So Filecoin is a mechanism that incentivizes people on the network to store your files in exchange for earning Filecoin. It's a distributed storage network that essentially allows you to write a computer program that says, I want to store my file chopped up and encrypted on other people's computers, instead of going to AWS or some other central server or central authority. And you will compensate those people for storing your files with Filecoin. And this is really big because, as we've talked about, most of the data on the web today is stored by a handful of players. And they essentially have control over your data. And so we've become increasingly reliant on these big internet players. So we believe that we can create this new internet that is completely decentralized, that is more robust, more reliant, more secure. And that is the vision behind the Filecoin project. And because it is completely open source, anyone can participate, anyone can build tools and apps on the network. So I just want to give you a few examples of what that looks like in action. Because one of the things that we talk about a lot, and I've probably said it here a lot, is that our mission is to preserve humanity's most important information. So the first example on the left is a project called the Starling Project. It's out of Stanford and USC. And they're using the Filecoin network to permanently preserve the USC Shoah Foundation's archive of 55,000 genocide survivor testimonies. So why store one set of copies or 3 sets of copies on a big tech server? Instead, chop it up and encrypt it and store it on the Filecoin network. And they've also used Starling, this technology, to document election security in the 2020 elections. So for 78 days, they had teams from Starling and Reuters documenting the presidential transition, and then those troves of data are stored on the Filecoin network. The Internet Archive, the next example, is one of the world's biggest digital libraries of internet sites and cultural artifacts in digital form, and they are storing portions of that archive on Filecoin. Slate is an open source file storage application. It's kind of like Dropbox for the D-Web. And then Audius is a music streaming platform that gives artists greater control over their work and how they connect with fans and how they are paid for their work. Basically, the bottom line here is just about any tool or service that is built on today's centralized model of the internet can be built on Web3. And these next generation tools will provide users with greater access to and control over their data. So I just want to play out sort of what this looks like what it means for business. And I'll use social media as an example. Like, what would a decentralized Twitter look like? So it would be built on the blockchain with open source software, meaning anybody could contribute. And the news feed would essentially be a database that is collectively updated by a network of computers and users rather than by a central authority. So when someone posts a status update or a message, the network of computers would validate that that message meets the guidelines of the network, and then they would agree to add it to the newsfeed. And we could create open source software for people to be able to read and create messages on the newsfeed. So in other words, the same way that you choose an email client today, whether it's Gmail or Hotmail or Yahoo, whatever you like, each has its own distinct like spam filtering or shortcuts or displays. You would have a choice of social media clients, and they would compete on things like speed and aesthetics and user interface and spam fighting. And the thing about this model that is so nice is that competition, as we have heard a couple times today, tends to keep players on their toes. So they improve their software and experience. So if you don't like one client service, you could port your data to another service. And projects like these are already in the works. There is a project called Mastodon, which is an open source social media service that's powered by independently run nodes, each with its own code of conduct, terms of service, privacy options, and moderation policies. So we all understand the risk of single points of failure. And it brings me back to this original idea of like the importance of community. No single person or company or government should be responsible for preserving our collective history. And we have always recognized the need to capture that moment and pass it down to future generations. That's why we have museums and libraries and monuments. When we have no more World War II veterans left among us, we will still have a memorial to honor them. And that's exactly why projects like the Starling Lab are so important for capturing and maintaining these historical records. But it's really up to all of us to be good stewards of our information. Digital space is finite, data can decay or become corrupted, and one bad blackout could equal a wipeout for an individual or an industry or a government. So I would argue that the best way to preserve and protect humanity's most important information is to expand and strengthen the decentralized web. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I think Web3 and the decentralized web are such a timely topic. It's becoming more mainstream of a concept, but I think for a lot of us, it's just started to enter, our space and trying to learn more about it. So I really appreciate the analogies and the clear explanations of those concepts. So hopefully we'll get to come back to them in a little bit with Q&A. But yeah, Ryan, thanks for getting the slides up, and go ahead and kick off.
Great. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you, Amani. Thank you. Excellent presentation, Rachel. An area that I didn't know much about, so always great to learn something new. I found it really interesting. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ryan Bowers. I'm Senior Counsel at General Motors. I focus my practice in areas of privacy, cybersecurity, and data. So I'm generally exposed to all of GM's latest and greatest technologies. I'm going to talk about some of the areas the automotive industry and GM is looking to innovate, and then how we're getting there, how the legal team is adapting to get there, and then how our service providers can adapt as well. So I like to start discussion with a quote from our CEO that was actually from 2016 now. I have no doubt that the automotive industry will change more in the next 5 to 10 years than it has in the last 50. And it's interesting to look at that quote now as we're 5 years into that time frame, and to see how much has changed and how much change is coming to the industry. GM has framed its change around our vision to create a world of zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion. 3 very important things, 3 very different things that you'll see in all of our initiatives. I want to start with electric vehicles. So anyone who follows the auto industry knows electric vehicles is an area of a big push for all OEMs. GM is looking to launch 30 new EVs globally by the end of 2025. And when we talk about electric vehicles, it's not a discussion that is just making electric vehicles and selling them. It's discussion around innovations in battery technology. It's discussion around the charging infrastructure and the charging network that is critical to consumers in how they approach that purchase decision. It's about integration with your mobile phone and your digital life, and understanding your vehicle, how it performs, and then really being able to see that data around your vehicle, not just when you're in your car, but perhaps when you're in your house or when you're on your phone, to understand the charging status and distance and range and all of those aspects around the electric vehicle. The next area of innovation is autonomous vehicles. So autonomous vehicles have been around in a discussion for maybe the last 3, 4, or 5 years. An interesting development on November 1st, just about 2 weeks ago, the Cruise president was actually the first to ride in a driverless AV on a public road in San Francisco. Took a ride in a Cruise AV on a public road without any driver. There's videos online. I thought it was a very interesting video. For those who are interested, go check out the video, but continue to move forward in the area of autonomous vehicles. Another big change is the concept of the software-defined vehicle, which GM has labeled Ultify. And what this really represents is it's a new approach to vehicles. It's a new end-to-end software platform to bring in a sweeping set of capabilities to things like in-car subscriptions and using over-the-air updates to offer new apps and services. So when you look at the purchase of a vehicle, you think of it as, I'm purchasing X, Y, and Z as part of the vehicle. This approach of the software-defined vehicle is you're just purchasing the starting point of the vehicle, and you will continue to be able to purchase updates, changes, new apps, new services in your vehicle over the life of that vehicle delivered through connectivity. So really exciting time for changes to what your vehicle can be over the life of it. And then there's new business ventures. So one of the areas GM is looking at is BrightDrop. It's a new business venture that's offering electric delivery products, really the end-to-end ecosystem of delivery from electric vans to other mechanisms to deliver products and services from the first to the last mile. So all of these different things are structured around a new marketing initiative called Everybody In. And I think that's really a great way to finish this, talk about how it's all been branded around an Everybody In campaign to really set the tone for an optimistic and inclusive environment for this future, designed around a digital first environment. So the next thing I want to talk about is how does GM innovating in how we develop products. So the example I want to talk about today is a dedicated innovation team. So what GM has done is they've developed an innovation team back in 2018 to serve as really a startup incubator within the four walls of GM. So this allows businesses to come up with new ideas, to test those ideas, to research those ideas, to build those ideas in a different environment than the more traditional development environment of GM. New businesses have included the electric commercial vehicles, auto insurance, military defense, and expanding services around our GM connected brand, our OnStar brand, and more are on the way. It's a really interesting approach to product development in that it allows teams to move fast and to fail and to test things and to iterate without having to go through the full requirements around production, development, and deployment. And a lot of the things coming out of this innovation are structured around GM seeking to rely more on recurring revenue model from software and services rather than simply the production and selling of vehicles. So now I'm going to switch over to how is our legal team at GM supporting these innovations and these changes. So the first one I'm going to talk about is engagement for the entire life cycle of products. So what we've done is we've taken our legal teams and we are engaging with the business and technical teams at the very earliest stages of development. It's not, okay, here's a product, we're going to bring it to legal, review it and provide our feedback. It's more of a partnership from the very earliest stages of product development. We're able to come in and provide, that directional feedback early on to, showstoppers that may exist or key hurdles that you'll face during your process, and really partner with the business for the entire life cycle. And then we have regular check-ins throughout the development, including post-launch. I think one of the key areas is supporting products post-launch for the entire life cycle. So it's not just getting it to market, it's what's the product going to be in 5 years? What is it going to be in 10 years? And how do we structure it in a way that we can continue to support it throughout its entire life cycle? One of the things we've done at GM is we've moved to a more dedicated embedded legal support model where, instead of having an attorney who may serve in a role supporting all businesses on subject matters, we have attorneys who are embedded with our groups for all of their issues. So EV growth, that's our electric vehicle growth team, our innovation team, our e-commerce team, and by embedding them in those groups, they can really understand the business, the models, and provide kind of the best legal support. We also approach it from a value-added legal support model where, it's not a no, it's a let's come up with a solution to get to the best solution to move forward. And it's really just a different mindset of how we partner with our teams. It's not yes or no, it's we can find a solution and here's how we're going to get there. Another thing we've done is come up with a transactions playbook. And this is not just the typical, here's some standard form templates, but something that's maintained in a real-time, up-to-date and accessible format that is really, it's efficient, it has consistent, and it's up-to-date. And I keep saying up-to-date because a lot of times you'll have a playbook or templates that get out of date very quickly. And by structuring the way we have around a technology platform, we're able to see those edits and collaborate in real time among our various teams to make sure we have the most up-to-date approach to our key language. And then new digital solutions developed by the legal team. First example is I do a lot of privacy work at GM. So if you're familiar with privacy impact assessments, we looked at solutions. We looked at our current paper and approach, and a few years ago set out to build a in-house designed and developed solution that we've rolled out globally, which has really provided a much more efficient approach to privacy reviews. Like everywhere, data is key. So we've implemented data-driven dashboards are very important to our legal teams and other solutions that take all of the data we have available and allow us to have real-time insights into our cases, our matters, and how we're performing. And then various reporting tools to help our legal teams stay in touch on critical issues and critical matters across our global team. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is how can outside counsel effectively support in this environment. So the first thing I always say is understand your client's technology. And I don't mean this that you have to have a deep technical understanding of, all the ins and outs, but it's have a basic technical understanding so that you can provide that legal advice. And the second part of this, even if you must seek more info, I don't see this very often, but when I see it, I'm really impressed. If someone comes to me and say, we're looking at this issue, but we'd like to take 30 minutes, an hour and sit down and just have a discussion with this team about your product. We want to understand it. And that's a really important value-added service to say, it's not about legal support. It's just about, we need to understand this connected technology better if we're going to provide legal support around it. I'm very impressed when I see those kind of sessions sought out by our outside counsel. All right, the next one is understanding the client's business. There was Rafael may mention this in his presentation about new business models and goals, really understanding what those new business models, what those goals are, even if they're constantly changing. Where is the industry headed and what are the next key legal issues? This is really important, is having outside counsel who can stay ahead of those issues, can identify what's that next issue that's coming and ramp up on it and provide that advice even before we know we may need it. And then the last one is changing consumer expectations and behavior. An example here is in the area of privacy. Understanding where are consumers going, where's the market going, and how is that impacting the legal advice that you're providing. Innovation is always important, but I don't think it's, someone else made a comment that it's not everything. So leveraging new technologies is appropriate, or is important, but only where appropriate. I don't like to see technology platforms used for legal support, which don't provide any additional value and are just technology for technology's sake. So find the right mechanisms where they can increase efficiency, better transparency, improve communication, things of that nature. And then last, just creative approaches are always very valuable in these spaces as we're looking at new business models, new technologies, alternative approaches, and then really those value-added services that I mentioned before. So I know we're out of time, so I'll stop there and leave some time for questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ryan. You had the challenge of going last in a really packed hour. Everybody did keep right around 12 minutes. And it was so much great content, but thanks for going last and getting us right in at 1 o'clock Eastern. I don't know if our panelists have extra time for Q&A. I'm happy to stick around a couple minutes, but I can also wrap this up. And as I've suggested, also we can kind of continue a conversation asynchronously on LinkedIn and Twitter with hashtag LVN Innovation. There were so many themes, as Rachel mentioned, both from kind of the common themes of disaggregation between the energy and the data storage, but also so much to think about from the market disruption, business model disruption of the incumbents, and then also two of you are market entrants. But there were also themes with Ryan and Dave for that, kind of focusing on the why, but also just communicating to an organization that needs to change. How do you incentivize that? How do you, Ryan shared some of the quotes from the CEO and the vision. And I think probably Dave, I'm sure there's a lot of communication around vision and focusing on the why to get people to change an existing organization into a new kind of organization with new processes. So I'm sorry we can't dive in too much, but I don't know if you wanted to share any kind of final thoughts, having heard other presentations about kind of themes that you all saw. Yeah, Dave, go ahead.
I have just one theme on that last point that you made. And I mentioned that historically we're a B2B company, but now increasingly we're having to go B2B and B2C. And so we have direct interface with the end user as well as the incumbent. And one of the questions is, how to incentivize. It's hard when you have the incumbent player, particularly if they're busy and they're enjoying their business model that is now being disrupted. And one way that we're trying to do that in our little corner of the world is by creating that value to the end user of the connection to hearing, to overall health and wellness, rather than focusing solely on what they've been used to providing and receiving from the incumbent player. So in this case, the end user is partnering, still going through the professional, but coming back to them. And in turn, the incumbent is realizing it's expanding their scope of practice and role with that partner, and opens up new avenues for business activity for them in what they saw initially as a threat was now an opportunity.
To Rafael's point about business model innovations, bridging industries, we could definitely see some themes there with legal, as we do have these different business models with the alternative legal service companies and LSPs, and even regulatory changes with who can invest in law firms. We'll also need to find ways to kind of show how the incumbent legal services can maybe broaden or deepen, or seeing some act as managed service providers, which I think maybe is similar to that idea of expanding to wellness, and maybe expanding to the service provider and manager of different service providers. I want to be respectful of all of your time, so I'm going to let everyone go here, unless there's final thoughts from anyone else. Rachel, were you diving for the mute button, or just
No, I wasn't. I wasn't.
Okay.
I just saw that there was a question in the chat, but I will let everybody go. And Amol, if you want to shoot me an email, it's rachel@fil.org, FIL.org, and we will continue the discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dave, Rachel, Rafael, and Ryan. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. And I look forward to maintaining relationships with all of our speakers and learning more from you as we in our professional lives. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, Amani. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.